step back from the door, your hired help who got ideas above her station, and this house is being managed properly now." She set the pie down in the snow, very gently, and smiled. "By the time these locks open again, this man will be begging me for the key, and I want you to watch exactly how a quiet woman takes a house back. Let me take you back." The voice on the other side of the storm door belonged to Tessa, her son's wife's older sister, a woman who had eaten at Lucinda's table maybe 4 times and never once carried a dish to the sink. The brass deadbolt was new. Lucinda could see the bright tooling around it, the little curls of fresh wood where some hurried drill had bitten into a door her late husband had hung straight 30 years before. Behind the glass, the front room glowed. Her grandchildren were in there. Dylan, who was 9, pressed his palm flat to the window and waved, because to a 9-year-old, a grandmother on the porch is a happy thing, not a problem. Lucinda waved back. Slow, easy. The way you wave so a child doesn't learn fear from your face. It was Christmas Eve in Yakima, and the snow was coming down soft and patient over Tieton Drive, the kind that doesn't blow, just settles, like it has all night and means to use it. She had a pie in her hands, sweet potato still warm through the cloth, the crust crimped the way her own mother had taught her 60 years gone. She had baked it at 4 that morning in a kitchen that was, by every paper that mattered, hers. "Marcus," she said, not loud. She never had to be loud. "Marcus, open the door and talk to your mother like a man." Her son did not come to the door. That was the part she would remember longest after all the rest of it was settled. 41 years old, and the boy she carried, fed, sat up with through 3 bouts of pneumonia, sent the wife's sister to do the talking through a pane of glass. She heard his voice once, low, somewhere back by the kitchen, saying something about it being for the best, as if she were a draft he was trying to seal out. She did not pound the door. She did not raise her voice. People who knew Lucinda Ohlsson would tell you that was the frightening part, if you understood her at all. The stiller she got, the more trouble was already on its way. She bent at the knees, the way a careful woman bends, and set the pie down in the snow on the top step. Very gently, so it wouldn't spill. So whoever found it later would know it had been placed, not dropped. Then she walked back down the steps she had swept 10,000 times, got into her old gray Buick, let the engine warm a full minute the way Erik always insisted, and drove away from the butter yellow house with the wraparound porch she repainted every June. She did not cry. I want you to hold on to that. She would not cry once in this whole story, and not because she couldn't, because she had decided a long time ago in a different doorway that her tears were not going to be the thing anybody got to watch. Now, let me take you back. Take you. To understand how a woman drives away from her own front door on Christmas Eve and ends up the only person in the county who can open it, you have to understand the house. And to understand the house, you have to understand the tin. On the kitchen windowsill, above the sink where the morning light came in gold through the lace, there sat a cocoa tin. Old, the paint worn pale at the corners, a Dutch girl on the front faded to a ghost. It had held actual cocoa exactly once. The winter Erik bought it in 1986. After that, it held other things. And the rule in that house, spoken to every child and grandchild who ever ran through the kitchen, was the same. You do not move the tin. You don't shake it. You don't open it. You don't slide it 2 inches to set down a glass. Marcus had grown up under that rule. He thought it was sentiment. He thought it was an old woman's fussiness, the same fussiness he was always razzing her about. The labels, the folders, the dates written in her steady hand on every envelope that ever came through the mail slot. He never once asked what was in the tin. That, more than anything, is the whole story. Lucinda Ohlsson was 68 years old. For 40 of those years, she had worked at the regional hospital downtown, in medical records. The windowless rooms 3 floors down where the whole human story of a city gets filed, born, broke a wrist, had a baby, mended, passed. She knew where everything was. That was her gift and her trade. Give Lucinda a name and a year, and she could put her hand on the right paper before you finished asking. She retired with a sheet cake and a card signed by people who'd come to her in a panic 100 times and never once been told no. She had a way about her, low voice even, never hurried. When she was thinking, she folded her hands in her lap, one over the other, and went so quiet you'd swear the room got dimmer. She sang second alto at Bethel Faith on Natchez Avenue and brought the casserole when somebody died, the good one, with the crackers crushed on top. She painted that porch every June, not because it needed it every June, but because the doing of it, the smell of the paint and the ache in her shoulders by dinner told her she was still the woman who kept things up. She had not always had a house. That mattered. Some wounds don't heal, they just teach you. When Lucinda was a girl, her mother kept house for a family across town, kept it spotless. 22 years of waxed floors and ironed sheets, and a side door she came and went through so she wouldn't be seen at the front. The lady of that house used to pat her mother's hand and say the place would be hers one day, that there was no one they trusted more, that it was as good as written down. It was never written down. The day the old woman passed, the grown children came with a moving truck and a sheriff's deputy, and Lucinda, 12 years old, watched her mother carry her own life out a side door in 2 grocery sacks. Promises, she learned that afternoon, are air. Paper is stone, and the people who own the paper own the ending. She swore, standing on that curb at 12, that no piece of paper would ever betray her the way that one did, that nobody would ever again decide she had ideas above her station. You'll hear that phrase again. Hold it. She married Erik Ohlsson at 26, a quiet man, a pipe fitter with hands like catcher's mitts and a habit of reading the fine print of everything, insurance, warranties, the backs of cereal boxes. He used to laugh that the two of them were the only people in Yakima who actually read what they signed. They bought the lot on Tieton Drive when it was just a foundation and a stack of lumber. And Erik built half that house with his own hands. The porch railings, the window boxes, the narrow stairs up to the little office on the second floor where he kept his ledgers and his fishing magazines, and later, things he didn't talk about. That office. Keep it in mind, too. Erik kept it locked the last 2 years of his life, and when Lucinda asked, he only said, "When you need what's in there, you'll know to look." She thought it was the fishing magazines. She thought it was grief making him strange. He had a slow trouble in him by then, the kind that takes a man in inches. And there are things a dying man does with his quiet that the living don't notice until much, much later. He passed on a Tuesday in October, 6 years before that Christmas Eve. Lucinda held his hand and sang low until the singing was the only sound in the room. And then she folded her hands in her lap and sat with him a long while before she called anyone. After that, it was just her in the house, and for a while, that was enough. The grandchildren came on Sundays. Dylan and his little sister Margaret, named for Lucinda's own mother, the one with the 2 grocery sacks. Marcus came less. Marcus had married Renata, and Renata had a family, the Pruitts, who had money the loud way, boats and granite, and a manner of looking at Lucinda's worn good furniture, like they were pricing it for a yard sale. They called her Marcus's mother even to her face, the way you'd say the contractor or the girl who does the lawn. Lucinda noticed. She noticed everything. It was her trade. But she let it lie, because Marcus was her son, and you carry a thing a long way for your son. What she did not know, that autumn before Christmas, was that Marcus was drowning. He'd put money into one of his father-in-law's ventures, and the venture had gone sideways and taken a second helping of his savings with it. He'd refinanced his own place in Salah, and that hadn't been enough. He had started in the way frightened men do to look around at what else there was. And what else there was, in his mind, was the butter-yellow house on Tieton Drive, the one he assumed in his bones would come to him, because he was the son, because that's how it goes. Because his mother was a sentimental old woman who kept cocoa tins full of nothing on a windowsill and would surely understand that an asset has to be managed properly. Managed properly. He'd started using that phrase around the dinner table that fall, testing it. The way a man rehearses a lie until it sounds like care. We just want to make sure the house is managed properly, Mom, at your age. Renata would nod. The Pruitts would nod. And Lucinda would fold her hands in her lap and go quiet and pass the rolls. She was not, in fact, a sentimental old woman. She was a records archivist who had spent 40 years learning exactly what a sentence in the right ledger could do to a life. And there was a sentence recorded down at the Yakima County Recorder's office on 2nd Street that none of them had ever thought to read. But that is getting ahead. Back to the autumn and the Sundays and the slow tightening of a thing nobody named out loud. In November, Marcus asked her, gentle as anything, whether she still kept all the house papers up in Dad's old office. She said she kept her papers where she always had. He asked if he could take a look sometime, help her organize. She said the office was Erik's and the door stayed shut. He smiled and let it go. But she saw the look that crossed his face, quick, there and gone. And 40 years of reading what people don't say told her something she didn't want to know yet. Her son was looking for a door, and he meant to go through it whether she opened it or not. 3 weeks before Christmas, the locksmith's truck would be parked outside that house, while Lucinda was at choir practice on Natchez Avenue, singing second alto, with no idea that $200 and 40 minutes were quietly turning her into a guest in her own home. But she'd taught the whole records department one thing above all others for 40 years, in that windowless room downtown. Whoever holds the document holds the ending. And there was a document. There was a voice on a cassette in a locked office. There was a tin nobody was allowed to move. She just hadn't had a reason to reach for any of it yet. She was about to be given one. She just hadn't had a reason to reach for any of it yet. She was about to be given one. The reason came on a Thursday, the second week of December, dressed up as kindness the way the worst things usually are. Renata called. Not Marcus, Renata. She had a bright telephone voice, the kind that sounds like it's smiling at you through the wire whether it means to or not. She said the family wanted to do Christmas Eve at the house this year, the big house, the Tieton Drive house, because it had the room and the tree fit better in the front window. And wouldn't that be nice, Lucinda, to have everyone together where Marcus grew up? Lucinda said yes before the woman finished asking. Of course, yes. It was the thing she wanted most in the world and had stopped letting herself say out loud. Her grandchildren on the stairs, the table pulled out to its full length with both leaves in, the good cloth, the candles, Dylan and little Margaret in their church clothes, complaining about their church clothes. She said yes, and she meant it down to the floor of her. She spent 10 days getting ready. She washed the curtains and pressed them. She waxed the floors Erik laid, on her knees, 68 years old, because some things you don't trust to a machine. She bought a fresh tin of paint she didn't need and touched up the porch rail anyway, in the cold, because her hands wanted to be doing something for the joy of it. She planned the meal like a campaign. Ham and the sweet potato pie and the casserole with the crackers crushed on top, the good one, the funeral one, except this time for a celebration. What she did not know was that on one of those 10 days, while she was 3 miles away on Natchez Avenue singing second alto, a small white truck pulled into her driveway and a man got out with a canvas bag of tools. She found out about the truck later. Old Mr. Cobb across the street told her, the way neighbors tell you things they've been chewing on. He'd seen the truck. He'd seen Marcus's car behind it. He'd thought it was odd. A locksmith at Lucinda's on a weekday with Lucinda not home. But it wasn't his business, and a man learns at a certain age to mind the line of his own yard. He told her he was sorry he hadn't called. She told him there was nothing to be sorry for, that you cannot stand guard over a thing you have no reason to think is in danger. But she filed it. The day, the time, the truck. She filed it the way she filed everything, in the steady drawer at the back of her mind where the dates lived. Christmas Eve came down soft over Yakima. The snow started in the afternoon and didn't stop, settling on Tieton Drive and the bare trees and the roof lines all down toward the barge chestnut blocks, that patient snow that means to stay. Lucinda dressed in her good blue. She wrapped the pie in a cloth and held it warm against her in the car. She drove the few minutes to the house she had lived in for 30 years, parked at the curb because she figured the driveway would be full, and walked up the path she had shoveled 10,000 times. The tree was in the front window. Her tree, in her window, lit up gold and red, and through the glass she could see the table set, and she could see her grandbabies, and her whole chest opened up like a window in summer. Then she tried the door. It didn't give. Not stuck, not swollen with the cold. It didn't give the way a door doesn't give when the thing holding it is brand new and was put there on purpose. She looked, and there it was, bright in the porch light. A brass deadbolt that had never been part of any door Erik hung. The little curls of fresh wood, the tooling marks, a lock her key would never touch. You know what came next because that is where this story began. The storm door. Tessa's voice through the glass, the woman who had eaten at her table 4 times and never carried a dish to the sink. Stepped back from the door. Hired help. Ideas above her station. The house being managed properly now. Dylan's small palm flat against the window, waving, because to a child, a grandmother on the porch is only a happy thing. And Marcus's voice somewhere back by the kitchen, low, saying it was for the best. She set the pie down in the snow, very gently, and she drove away. Now, here is the part they none of them counted on. Because a different woman, 99 women out of 100, would have driven to a daughter's or a sister's, or just around and around the cold streets crying where nobody could watch. Lucinda did not do any of that. Lucinda drove downtown. She knew the building the way you know a house you grew up in, because in a way she had. The Yakima County offices on 2nd Street. 40 years she'd worked 3 floors down in a different building doing the same essential thing, keeping the paper that keeps people honest, and she knew that the recorder's office stayed open until 5 even on Christmas Eve because the law does not take the day off and neither does the deadline on a filing. She parked. She walked in out of the snow with it melting on the shoulders of her good blue coat, and there behind the long counter closing up was a face she knew. Ms. Delgado. Younger than Lucinda by 30 years, a serious woman with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, who had come into the records department as a girl who didn't know a chain of title from a chain letter, and whom Lucinda had trained, patiently, over 2 years, in the religion of the dated document. Ms. Delgado looked up, and her whole face changed. "Mrs. Ohlsson," she said, "it's Christmas Eve. What in the world?" "I need to pull a deed," Lucinda said, low, even. Hands folded on the counter, one over the other. "My house, Tieton Drive." And she gave the parcel number from memory, all of it, the way you'd give your own birthday. "Ms. Delgado didn't ask why a woman comes in out of the snow on Christmas Eve to look at the deed to her own home. Maybe she saw something in the stillness. She just went to the system and she pulled it and she printed it. And she slid it across the counter the way you'd hand someone back something precious they'd dropped. "You filed this yourself, Mrs. Ohlsson," she said quietly. "You know what it says." Lucinda looked down at the paper, and there it was, in the dry, beautiful language of the recorder's office, the chain of title to the butter yellow house on Tieton Drive. And at the end of that chain, the current and sole owner of record was a name. One name. Not Erik's and Lucinda's together the way she had half assumed all these years without ever once going to check. Because why would a woman check the floor she's been standing on her whole life? Lucinda Ohlsson. Her name. Alone. Recorded, the stamp said, on a date 6 years gone. The autumn Erik was dying. She stood very still. The snow dripped off her coat onto the county's floor. And a thing she had not understood for 6 years began, slowly to come into focus, like a photograph in a tray. Erik. The locked office at the top of the narrow stairs. When you need what's in there, you'll know to look. The 2 years he kept that door shut and only said it was the fishing magazines. A dying man does things with his quiet that the living don't notice until much, much later. He hadn't been hiding. He had been building. The same hands that laid the floor and crimped the window boxes had, in his last good months, gone down to this very counter, or one just like it, and put the house in his wife's name alone, where no son's debt and no son's wife's family and no relatives sneering through a storm door could ever reach it. He had known. Somehow, the way long-married people know things in the dark, Erik had known there would come a night like this one, and he had stood between her and it from 6 years in the grave. Lucinda Ohlsson did not cry. I told you she wouldn't. But she put one hand flat on the cold counter for a moment, the way you steady yourself on the rail of a boat, and Ms. Delgado pretended to be very busy with the printer. I taught you, Lucinda said at last, almost to herself, that whoever holds the document holds the ending. You did, said Ms. Delgado. And then the younger woman frowned. She was still looking at her screen, at the full record, the way a trained person looks, reading down past the part that answers the question to the part nobody asked. Lucinda saw the frown and knew it, because it was her own frown, the one she'd put on that face years ago. Mrs. Ohlsson, Ms. Delgado said slowly, there's a second recording against this address. It's recent, 3 weeks ago. She adjusted the glasses down out of her hair onto her nose. There's a lien. Somebody recorded a deed of trust against this property 3 weeks ago, securing a loan. She looked up. Did you authorize a lien? Did you sign for a loan against the house? I did not, Lucinda said. The two women looked at each other across the counter while the snow came down on 2nd Street outside the dark windows. Then who did? Said Ms. Delgado. It wasn't quite a question. Lucinda already knew. She had known, if she was honest, since the moment she saw the curls of fresh wood around the brass deadbolt, since the phrase managed properly had first crossed her son's mouth at her own dinner table that autumn, like a word he was practicing. She just hadn't let it finish forming until now. Marcus had borrowed money, a great deal of money, from the size of the number Ms. Delgado was turning the screen to show her. He had borrowed it against the house on Tieton Drive. He had pledged as the thing that made the loan safe, the thing the bank could take if he failed to pay, a house that was not his to pledge, a house that had not been his for 6 years and that he had never once thought to go down to 2nd Street and check on, because he assumed, the way his mother's employers had assumed, that the promise was as good as the paper, that it would simply come to him, because he was the son, because that is how it goes. It is not how it goes. Paper is stone. Lucinda had learned that on a curb at 12 years old watching 2 grocery sacks go into the back of a car, and she had spent a lifetime making sure she was never on the wrong side of the lesson again. Her son was about to learn it in one night. She thought of the cocoa tin then, sitting on the windowsill in the dark kitchen 3 miles away. Behind a deadbolt her key wouldn't open. The tin nobody was allowed to move. She thought about what was in it, what had always been in it, the folded copy of this very deed and the small cassette in Erik's blocky hand, and she thought, with something that was almost, not quite, but almost a smile, they changed the lock on the door. They never thought about the lock that mattered. Ms. Delgado, she said, I'm going to need certified copies. The deed, the full chain, and that lien with the recording stamps. Tonight, if the machine will do it. It's Christmas Eve, Mrs. Ohlsson. I know what day it is, child, Lucinda said gently. It's the day a man tried to put me out of my own house. Let's make sure the paper remembers it. And Ms. Delgado, who had been taught by the best, started printing. Ms. Delgado, who had been taught by the best, started printing. And the machine in the corner of that quiet office woke up and began its patient work, sheet after sheet sliding warm into the tray, and Lucinda watched each one come out with the recording stamp dark and official in the corner, the way you'd watch bread rise. The deed. The full chain going back to the year Erik's hands first signed for the lot. And then the other thing, the recent thing, the deed of trust dated 3 weeks gone, with a number on it that made the room feel colder than the snow outside had any right to make it. She did not read that number out loud. She folded the pages once, lengthwise, and slid them into the inside pocket of her good blue coat, against her chest, where she had carried warm pies and cold news both in her time, and knew the difference by the weight. "Mrs. Ohlsson," said Miss Delgado, and her bright clerk's voice had gone soft and careful now. "Whatever this is, you don't have to do it tonight. It's Christmas Eve. Go to family." "I went to family," Lucinda said. "Family put a new lock on my door." She buttoned the coat over the papers. "I'll go to a lawyer Monday. Tonight I just needed the paper to remember the date." "Paper has a better memory than people, child. You taught a whole department that?" "No, I taught it to a whole department, and you were in the front row." "Ms." Delgado walked her to the door, though she didn't have to, and unlocked it, though the building was closing, and stood in the lit doorway with the snow coming down past the street lamps on 2nd Street, and watched the older woman go down the steps, holding the rail, careful, deliberate, 68 years old and unhurried as a season. Then she did a thing she would not tell anyone she did. She went back to the screen, and she pulled the contact record on that deed of trust, and she wrote down, in her own private hand, the name of the lending office that had recorded it. Because she had been taught that when a thing is wrong on the paper, you do not wait to be asked. You note it, you date it, and you keep your copy. Lucinda did not drive home, because she did not that night have a home she could get into. She drove instead to the only place that was still hers in the simple animal sense, which was the curb in front of the butter-yellow house on Tieton Drive. And she sat there with the engine running and the heater going and the snow filling in her own footprints on her own front path, and she looked at her tree in her window for a long time. The grandchildren had gone to bed by then, she supposed. The lights still burned. Somebody had left the porch light on, which struck her as almost funny, leaving the light on for a woman they'd bolted out. A knuckle on the passenger glass made her jump. It was old Mister, Cobb from across the street, in a parka thrown over what looked like his nightclothes, his breath smoking. She rolled the window down. "Saw your car," he said. "Saw you out here in the cold a while now. Lucinda, what in the name of sense is going on over there?" He looked at the house, at the lit tree, at the cars in the drive that weren't hers. Understanding came over his old face in a slow tide. "They didn't," he said. "On Christmas Eve, they didn't." "They did," she said. He stood there a moment with his hand still on the door of the car, as if to keep it, or her, from sliding away into the storm. And then he said a thing she had not known, a thing that came out of him the way the truest things come, sideways and unasked. "You're Erik," he said. "You know what that man did. Years back when Della was sick and the bills got up past anything we could see the top of, and there was a lien put on our house, Lucinda. 41 years we'd been in it. I never told you this. I was ashamed. And 1 month, the lien was just gone, released. I went down to the county myself thinking it was a mistake, and it wasn't a mistake. Somebody had paid it. Quiet. Wouldn't put their name to it where I'd see. Took me 2 years to work out it was Erik. He never said a word. Wouldn't let me thank him. Said a man's roof was a man's roof, and that was the end of it. Cobb's eyes were wet, and he blamed it on the cold the way men do. That's the kind he was. He kept people in their houses. And now look what they're doing in his. Lucinda sat very still with her hands on the wheel. He kept people in their houses, she repeated, slow, because the words had landed somewhere deep and were still going down. Of course he had. Of course that was the shape of the man. The same hands that crimped the window boxes and laid the floor and put a deed in his wife's name alone against a night he could see coming had also, quietly in the dark, gone and lifted a stone off a neighbor's roof and never once asked to be seen doing it. She had married a man who understood exactly one thing better than anyone she ever knew, which was that paper could be a weapon or paper could be a mercy. And the only question that mattered was whose hand was holding it. "Mr. Cobb," she said, "I'm going to be back here in a day or two with the right people and the right papers, and I'm going to walk into that house through the front door. I'd take it kindly if you'd remember when anybody asks what day they locked me out and what time you saw me sitting at this curb." "I'll remember," he said. "I'll write it down tonight." "Good man," she said. Erik picked his neighbors right. She did not go to a hotel. She went to her church friend Pearl's on Natchez and slept in a spare room with a quilt that smelled of cedar. And in the morning, Christmas morning, she did not weep into her coffee. She made phone calls. She had spent 40 years knowing which office opened, when, and which human being inside it would actually pick up. And a lifetime of choir and casseroles and sitting up with the sick had built her a web of people who owed her nothing but a kindness and would give it gladly. By the afternoon of the day after Christmas, she had an appointment with a lawyer named Whitfield who handled property, and a quiet word in to a sheriff's deputy who happened to be Pearl's sister's boy, about a civil matter of lawful entry to a residence owned, sole and clear, by the woman standing in front of him. Because here is the thing they had not thought through. Marcus and Renata and the Pruitts and Tessa, with her ideas about who was hired help. You cannot lock the owner out of her own house. You can change the brass on the door. You can stand behind the storm glass and say cruel things through it. You can move a tin off a sill if you can find the nerve. But the law in Yakima County and everywhere else does not recognize a deadbolt as a deed. The paper does not care who holds the key. The paper cares who holds the paper. And Lucinda held the paper. They went on the 28th. The deputy, polite and uncomfortable in the cold, knocked. And it was Renata who came to the storm door this time, with her bright telephone face on, ready to manage things, and the bright face fell clean off her when she saw the deputy, and behind him Lucinda, calm in her blue coat holding a folder. "Ma'am," the deputy said, "I have here a recorded deed showing Mrs. Ohlsson is the sole owner of this property. She's going to come inside her home now. There's no charge being made today. But the lawful owner is going to enter, and I'd advise everyone to keep it civil." Marcus came up the hall fast. Mom, you don't understand. There's a whole situation with the financing that you are not equipped to." "Open the door, Marcus," Lucinda said. Low. Even. Hands folded over the folder. "Or the man with the badge will note that you wouldn't. You're going to want fewer of those notes by the time this is done. Not more." Something in how she said it, some flatness that was worse than any shout, made him reach past Renata and turn the new bolt. The door opened. Warm air and the smell of her own house, pine and ham gone cold, rolled out at her. She stepped over her own threshold for the first time in 4 days, and she did not look at any of their faces, because the faces were not the point. She walked through the front room, past her tree, past the long table still set with the good cloth she had ironed, and she went down the short hall into her kitchen. The cocoa tin was not on the sill. For one long breath, the whole thing teetered. Then she saw it, shoved to the back of a high cupboard behind the everyday glasses, where somebody had put it the way you put away a thing you don't understand but don't dare throw out. She had to reach. Tessa, in the doorway, said something about how that was private family property now, and Lucinda should not be touching things, and the deputy said, quietly, that everything in the house belonged to the owner of the house, and the room went still. Lucinda took the tin down. It was the old kind, painted with a Dutch girl gone faint with handling, dented on one corner from 30 years of being set down on a porch rail, while a woman fished for her keys. She held it against her the way she'd held the pie, and she did not open it there in front of them, because some things you do not let unkind eyes watch you open. She carried it out to the car. Then she came back once and stood in the front hall, and she looked at her son. "There's a door upstairs," she said, "that your father kept shut. You wanted into it bad enough this fall. Go on up with the deputy and open his desk. Bring me what's taped inside it. I think it's time you read what your father went to the county and did 6 years ago when he was dying, and you were too busy being his disappointment to notice he was still taking care of all of us, including you. He left something taped in that desk for the exact day one of his own would try a thing like this. I'd rather you found it yourself." She did not stay to watch him climb the narrow stairs. She went and sat in the car with the tin in her lap and her husband's old house key on its worn ribbon in her coat pocket. The brass one, the useless one now, the one no lock in that house would take any more. And she pressed her thumb to the lid of the tin and alone, where nobody could see, finally lifted it. Inside, just as she had always known and never once needed to check, was a folded copy of the deed, soft at the creases. And beneath it, small and square, a cassette, with 2 words on the label in Erik's blocky carpenter's hand. She read them. She set the tin on the seat beside her, very gently, the way she had set the pie down in the snow. And for the first time in 4 days, Lucinda Ohlsson let herself close her eyes. The meeting was set for the 2nd of January in a brick office off Yakima Avenue with frosted glass in the door and a radiator that knocked like a polite guest. Whitfield was a careful man with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, and he had asked Lucinda to bring everyone who thought they had a stake in the house. Because, he said, it was kinder to let people learn a thing all at once than to let them keep building on sand. So they came. Marcus came in a good coat that no longer fit the man inside it. Renata came with her telephone face packed away somewhere she couldn't reach it. And Tessa came, because Tessa could not stand to be anywhere a verdict was being read without being in the room to manage how it landed, and she sat with her purse on her knees like a shield. Lucinda came last in her blue coat, and she set on the polished table in front of her 3 things and did not say what they were. A folder, the cocoa tin, and, taken from her pocket and laid down with no ceremony at all, the old brass house key on its frayed ribbon, the one that fit no lock in that house anymore. She folded her hands over none of it. She just let it sit there, where the light could reach it, and she waited because she had spent 40 years in rooms where the documents did the talking, and she had learned that the person who speaks least is usually the person holding the most. "I'd like to start," Whitfield said, "with the title." And he slid the first certified page across the table to Marcus, recording stamped dark in the corner. "This is the recorded deed for the property on Tieton Drive. I direct your attention to the grantee, the person to whom the property was conveyed, and to the date." Marcus looked. Lucinda watched him look. She watched him read his mother's name, her full name, Lucinda Ohlsson, sole and several, and then watched his eyes drop to the date and stop there, because the date was older than his oldest child, older than his marriage, older than the version of himself that had decided this autumn that the house would simply fall to him like fruit. The deed had been hers since a year he could have walked down to 2nd Street and seen for himself, any day across 6 years, and never had, because checking is for people who do not assume. "That's not," he started. "There was an understanding. The house always." "There was no understanding, son," Lucinda said, low and even. "There was a deed. You've been standing on the difference your whole life without ever once looking down at your feet." Whitfield let the quiet do its work, then reached for the cocoa tin himself with her nod and lifted out the small square cassette in Erik's blocky hand. He had brought, for exactly this, an old player from a desk drawer, and he set it on the table and pressed the worn key, and into that brick office with its knocking radiator came the voice of a man 6 years dead. It was thinner than Marcus remembered. Erik had recorded it near the end. You could hear the work it cost him to push the words out, and that labor made every plain sentence land, like a hand set flat on the table. "If you're hearing this," Erik said, "then the day came that I hoped wouldn't, and somebody's trying to put your mother out of the house I built her. So listen, I put the place in Lucinda's name alone, on purpose, years back, when I still had the breath to walk into the county and do it right. Not because I didn't trust my boy, because I watched what happened to her mother. I watched what a promise is worth when there's no paper under it, and I swore the woman I married would never stand on a curb the way she stood as a girl. The house is hers. It was always going to be hers. I'm not leaving it to be argued over. I'm leaving it decided." A pause, the tape hissing. "Marcus, if it's you that made her play this, boy, I taught you to measure twice. You should have measured the deed." The tape ran out into hiss, and Whitfield clicked it off, and nobody in the room moved. Tessa's mouth had come a little open. Renata was looking at her own hands, and Marcus had put one of his over his face, not weeping, just covering it, the way a man does when the only privacy left to him is the inside of his own palm. Lucinda did not reach for him. There would be a time for that, maybe, down some road she couldn't see from here, but it was not this minute, because this minute had one more page in it, and she had carried that page against her chest for 9 days. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "show him the last one." The lawyer slid the third document across, the deed of trust. 3 weeks before Christmas, a sum on it that made Renata draw a breath, and a name across the top that none of them but Lucinda had seen before. A lending office out past the airport that dealt in fast money against slow assets. "This," Whitfield said, and his voice was gentle in the way a doctor's is gentle right before the hard part, "is a loan, a large one, secured against the house on Tieton Drive, pledged by you, Marcus, 3 weeks ago. The trouble is a man can only pledge what he owns, and by the recorded title we just read, you did not own one nail of that house on the day you signed this. You borrowed a great deal of money against your mother's property and represented it as your own." He took his glasses off. Their paperwork uses a particular phrase. "They told me on the phone they'd extended the funds on the understanding the asset was, and I'm quoting them, being managed properly." Those were their words, managed properly. Lucinda heard her son's autumn come back to her across that table. Managed properly. The phrase he had practiced at her dinner table like a new coat he was trying on. The phrase that had come through the storm door at her on Christmas Eve in another mouth. It had never been his phrase at all. He had borrowed it the same way he had borrowed the money, from a lender's letter, and worn it around her house pretending it meant he had grown wise, when all it had ever meant was that he was afraid. That was the whole engine of it, she saw now, plain as a stamp in a corner. He hadn't bolted the door to take something from her. He'd bolted it to keep her from finding out what he'd already lost. If she ever stood at that county counter, if she ever pulled the chain of title the way her whole life had trained her to, the loan would come apart in his hands. So he had changed the brass and called it management and prayed the old woman would just go quiet to a hotel. "Marcus," she said, "did you understand what I just said, or do you need to hear it twice? You signed my house away to strangers to cover a hole you dug, and you put a new lock on the door, so I wouldn't go count the silver and find it gone. I was going to fix it," he said, and his voice cracked clean down the middle. "I was going to make the payments and refinance before anybody. Before you ever, Mom. I had a plan. I just needed the title to be mine," she finished. "You needed the title to be anything but mine." And it never was. Whitfield cleared his throat. "There's a procedural matter," he said. "When a lien is recorded against a property the borrower doesn't hold title to, the lender, once they're aware, is obligated to act. I notified them, as I'm required to, that the security they were given was never the borrower's to give. They've placed a hold on the account. Everything's frozen pending their own review, and they've opened a referral on the origination." He looked at Marcus with something that was not unkindness. "That's not Mrs. Ohlsson doing anything to you. She doesn't have to lift a finger. You handed the bank a paper that wasn't true, and the bank is the one that has to answer for it now. She just declined to pretend it was true on your behalf. And here was the part Lucinda had thought about for 9 nights, the part she'd turned over in Pearl's spare room under the cedar quilt. She did not gloat. There was no satisfaction in it shaped like the satisfaction she'd imagined at 12, watching grocery sacks go into a stranger's trunk. It was quieter than that, and it was sadder than that, and it was, underneath, unbudgeable as stone. "I didn't come for the house," she said, and folded her hands at last over the closed folder. "I already own it. I've owned it longer than you've been shaving. I came to ask which of you wants to explain the loan." Nobody answered. Tessa, who had told her through a storm door what a hired woman's station was, found a great interest in the carpet. Renata had begun silently to cry, and Marcus reached across the table, slow, toward the brass key on its frayed ribbon. The old key, his father's key, as if taking it back into his hand might roll the season backward to a porch and a tin, and a mother he hadn't yet decided to lock out. Lucinda put 2 fingers on the ribbon and drew it gently to her side of the table. "No," she said, "not that one. You change the locks, son. You can ask the bank for the new key when they're done deciding what they're going to do with the mess you made. This one was your father's, and it comes home with me."
Still here.
She let that sit.
Like the key.
Then she opened the folder and took out one last page, one Whitfield had drawn up at her instruction the week before, and she signed it in front of all of them in her steady archivist's hand, dating it the way she dated everything, and slid it to the lawyer to be carried down to 2nd Street and recorded. A transfer on death deed, naming the grandchildren, direct, past Marcus, past Renata, past anyone who might someday practice a phrase at a dinner table. The children who had waved at her from the warm window on Christmas Eve would have the butter yellow house when she was done with it, and there would be paper under the promise, stamped and dated, so that no one would ever have to stand on a curb wondering whether the people who held the keys would remember. "What about the ones?" she said, mostly to Whitfield, mostly to the radiator, mostly to the girl she had been, who don't have their name on the deed because nobody ever taught them how to file it. Erik knew how. I knew how. We got lucky in each other. There's a whole city of people one storm door away from the curb because the only thing standing between them and the snow is a promise somebody made out loud. She buttoned her coat. Somebody ought to teach them. Maybe that's a thing for me to do with a Tuesday. The lender's referral went where such things go, into an office with its own slow patient machine, and a man past the airport who had signed funds against an asset that was being managed properly spent that winter, answering questions. And somewhere in a file, a notation was made, dated, cross-referenced, that would make the next loan officer who saw a son's confident signature pull the title first and check the grantee and the date, the way you check bread to see if it's done, before they handed over $1 against a house that wasn't his. By June, the porch needed paint, the way it did every June, and Lucinda was on the 2nd step in an old shirt with a brush in her hand and the yellow going on fresh over the gray of winter. The grandchildren sat above her on the boards she'd already done, careful of the wet drinking cocoa from the tin's worth of powder she'd made up that morning. The tin itself was back on the kitchen sill where it belonged, and nobody, anymore, would ever move it, because the new deed was folded soft inside it now, waiting for the day it would keep these children warm. She rinsed the brush and dried her hands, and went up the steps past the children into her own house, through her own front door. She holds the only key,